Encounters with cancel culture. Where does cancel culture come from? What is at stake in the fight against wokeness? Are there opportunities for new creative alliances in the defense of free speech? What follows is a panel discussion featuring Dr. James Lindsay. Dr. Lindsay is an American-born author, mathematician, and political commentator. He has written 6 books spanning a range of subjects, including religion, the philosophy of science, and postmodern theory. He is the founder of New Discourses and currently promoting his new book, Cynical Theories: How Activist Scholarship Made Everything About Race, Gender, and Identity, and Why This Harms Everybody. Rod Dreher, a visiting fellow of the Danube Institute and author of the New York Times anti-woke bestseller, Live Not by Lies, will lead the discussion with James Lindsay, and he will be joined by National Review journalist and online editor Charles Cooke, a critic of cancel culture in both its American and its British manifestations.
Hi, James. One of the things that stands out about you and your role, your leading role in combating wokeness in the U.S. is that you are like and I say this with in a complimentary sense, you're like the unkillable cockroach. They try to come down on you as hard as they can to destroy you, and you can't be killed. To what extent does being have a completely thick skin and as a combative personality, how much do you have to have that in order to withstand the torrent of abuse that you take from the woke?
You know, it helps. It helps a lot. It was something I had to grow. I was pretty sensitive at first. It took a long time to get comfortable with this kind of, as you said, torrent of abuse. People joke, they say that I can't be canceled because I'm pre-canceled, which I think is somewhat funny. But what it amounts to actually is that I adopted a rule. I figured out a rule about 1.5 years ago for myself engaging in social media. And it's kind of an unfolding, I'll say a rule, but it's really a couple of rules. And the first of the rules is that which happens on social media isn't real. And once you kind of adopt this attitude, like what's going on social media is sort of a funhouse in kind of both meanings of that word, it makes it a lot easier to tolerate what comes at you through social media. And I think that this is an incredibly important thing for people to develop as far as dealing with cancel culture where businesses and so on are involved. Just to draw a quick example, we look for, there's lots of cases, but the one that sticks out in my mind at the moment is we look at the case where Macy's made those plates that associated portion sizes to jean sizes, and one aggrieved person on Twitter went berserk. Macy's has to tear down the entire line, retract the entire line, hundreds of thousands of dollars of product get pulled down, big PR mess. And having an ethic that what happens on social media doesn't actually mean anything would have prevented all of that. Just keeping your head up and going and realizing what's happening on social media is amplifying in many cases the voices we should probably take least seriously most often is one thing. And the second rule I realized is once you understand that social media is like a fun house, then you have to adopt this and I'd say this, very cognizant of what I'm saying, but you have to adopt this very postmodern attitude, like to go very John Baudrillard with postmodernism. It's like he talks about the map and the terrain. He has this metaphor of a map that's a perfect analogy to all of reality. It touches reality at every single point, but still it's artificial. It's the map. That's like the internet. That's social media. It's this other world. And so I realized in this rule that I developed, and I think this was early last summer, a little over 1 year ago, was never put anything online you're not willing to see made fun of. And once you accept that everything that's happening there is fun and what's taking place in a fun house, you can all of a sudden withstand basically any of the attacks because they're not very serious. A third thing that you might realize, and it's not true, strictly speaking, but if you just assume that literally everybody replying to you on social media or bombarding you on social media is a psychological operation run by some foreign government, it makes it a lot easier to ignore what they're saying. And to some degree, that is actually the case. Some of those accounts are bots. Some of the accounts are just trolls, and some are genuine people. But if you treat all abuse as though it came from somebody who's either a bot account run by a foreign government, a bot account run by some political entity, or literally a crazy person, then it doesn't bother you anymore.
Well, I love one of the things you're best known for, and it's one of the greatest pranks ever to go against cancel culture, was the Grievance studies hoax. I wonder if you could briefly share what that was with our viewers, and talk about the role of humor in undermining these pious, puritanical wokesters.
Sure. So what gets called the Grievance Studies Affair was a project undertaken by myself with two colleagues, Peter Boghossian and Helen Pluckrose, who are quite well known for having done this. And we started in 2017, about a month or two from now. So we were formulating the ideas to maybe do this now, 4 years ago. That long? Oh my gosh. And so we spent the entire last half of 2017 and the first 3/4 or so of 2018 writing as many fake academic journal articles as we could in what we would now identify as the critical study of identity. So at first we thought we were targeting gender studies that blossomed into kind of feminist theory and critical race theory and some education theory, kind of the critical pedagogy stuff. And it blossomed out into all of these kind of critical studies. And we ended up writing 20 full articles, full research articles, and submitting them to the highest standing journals that we could. And in the process of a very kind of, we were very stymied from, our first paper we started formally writing in August of 2017. And we got nothing but bad news until February, near the end of February of 2018. So finally, starting in February of 2018 through the, just around October of 2018, they started to get accepted. And 7 of them were accepted for publication. One was awarded an honor for excellence in scholarship in the discipline. That discipline is, and I use the word discipline with my tongue in my cheek, is feminist geography.
What kind of papers? What were they on?
I mean, ultimately, the right thing to say is that we wrote sophistry. It's fun to say that we wrote ridiculous or absurd or evil or vile or heinous, or depending on the paper, different kind of adjectives of those sorts. And they were. We did intend them all to be either funny or shocking. So when we wrote up our analysis of this, we said every paper we wrote contained a so-called hoaxish element. And what that meant was that we thought we went too far into humor, arguing, for example, that bodybuilding is a fat-phobic sport, and to remedy this, it needs to include a category of fat bodybuilding, where what is built is body fat instead of muscle, and that it's only a social construction that we value the building of muscle over fat, and therefore we need to have fat bodybuilding as a category, but it can't be a competition because competitiveness is kind of against their ethos. So it's actually just a display or an exhibition of fat as a political statement. And we thought that was ridiculous. We had another paper where what I would put in the kind of the evil category, where we argued that privileged students, meaning white males primarily, need to be taught reparations in school. So first, schools need to be reordered with a progressive stack ideology that favors so-called oppressed and marginalized people in the classroom, so they get their questions answered, they get to interact. White males, we said, are invited to listen and learn in silence. And then we went further and said that they should, because there's a trope that says that men interrupt women a lot. We said that we need to answer this by having male students constantly spoken over and interrupted when they try to speak in class. We went further and said that they should sit in the floor rather than in desks, and they should maybe wear chains to experience reparations. And then we said that it was very important to make them as uncomfortable as possible so that they would feel the challenge to their privilege. And the peer reviewers wanted us to make them even more uncomfortable. They were not happy with the fact that we said that we should approach this with critical compassion. They wanted it to be pure pedagogy of discomfort, more and more discomfort. So it's these kinds of things. And I picked those 2 examples. A lot of people like to focus on the kind of ridiculous dog park paper where we talked about identifying that rape culture is a big problem in masculine society by watching dogs hump each other in dog parks, and which is preposterous. And a lot of people focus on that. But in all of these cases, what we're seeing again and again and again is the production of sophistry. We started with the conclusion or the joke or the gag or the scary thing that we wanted to try to force into an academic paper. And then it was a matter of how do we make the academic literature that's out there get this published at the highest level of academic publishing? How do we get a paper like this into Hypatia, which is a leading feminist philosophy journal? How do we get this paper into the dog paper, into the leading feminist geography journal, and get them to apparently award it for excellence? What does it take to start with our conclusion, work backwards, and then get this stuff published? And that means we weren't producing scholarship, we were producing sophistry. We started with our conclusion and then just made stuff up to get there. Sometimes it did involve making up ridiculously false data, which we tried to have purposed in various ways. For example, the dog park data were ridiculous. Other papers used data that were blatantly would have been cherry picked out of a larger data set to support a conclusion that doesn't represent what's really going on. And then other papers, literally, we had one paper that was on the track to acceptance but had not yet been accepted, where we and I saw this just happen in another actual study from MIT regarding mask wearing and the virus. We had a paper where we had I cooked up numbers so that there'd be no statistically significant result whatsoever that we were claiming, and then said, just because there's no statistics, that doesn't mean we can't rely on narrative and cook up some other way to make it true still. So this is a gross abuse of data, and that paper was on its way to being accepted. So these are the kinds of papers that we wrote. Now, of course, like I said, we tried mostly to be funny. Some of the papers were scary. Nothing particularly funny about the education paper. Nothing particularly funny about rewriting a chapter of Hitler's Mein Kampf, where he organizes the Nazi party and then replaces our movement with intersectional feminism and demands for solidarity. Nothing funny about those, but the rest of these papers were meant to be pretty hilarious. And humor actually has this kind of diffusive technique, but it also, it makes it so you can say things or show things and people laugh, and it gets it into their consciousness without them getting their backs up necessarily. It's not a direct frontal assault. It's kind of subversive, but in the right kind of way. I think if we look at the comedians that broke down racial and gender roles, especially in the 70s and 80s and 90s, you look at some of these huge famous comedians, Richard Pryor, Chris Rock, Eddie Murphy, and so on. You can look at these ways that they challenged tropes and actual racism or sexism or whatever with humor very successfully. And I think that's actually the best way to go about a critique in many regards when you have a lot of power puffed up in a situation. So I think that that's what we were really trying to do, knowing that humor softens the critique, it opens people's minds, it gives people the opportunity to see something in a different light. And so we were kind of going in that vein. So I think it's a very valuable thing. And at the same time, since what we were doing was producing sophistry, I think that it allows for the injection of the argument that we were trying to make, which is ultimately that these very now influential fields of academic study are based, at least in part, in people being able to start with their conclusion and make it up to get there, not based in rigorous and careful parsing of data or evidence, not based even in necessarily reason, but based in, what do I want to argue? What is the conclusion that I've drawn about society? And how do I make a case for it? And kind of the pinnacle, just to touch one more point within that we tried to bring out, is that one of the methods that they've adopted is called autoethnography, which is literally a diary. I've had some personal experience. I write a diary with academic citations in it, and now this is considered ethnographic based on my personal experience, literally walking around in the city. There's it got some attention, famous autoethnography that we actually cited in one of our papers, where a young woman goes shopping for action figures and can't find the Wonder Woman doll at the store that she wants to go to. And this proves that there's a sexist conspiracy against women in action figures that holds back girls. And it's just her own experience. And the paper itself is her going on a date with some guy, and all of her like kind of emotional experiences kind of falling in love with this guy while they go try to find Wonder Woman, and then comparing that to discussions she had with 6 of her female friends or something. I mean, it's just preposterous that this would be considered rigorous. And so what we wanted to expose is that what's happening, and these are very influential fields now, as we all see, is not rigorous in any regard.
So James, let's go back one stage further than that. I mean, you're a scientist. Why did you embark on this in the first instance? You've said why you did it once you had decided to start, but there is a journey that you took from being a scientist and no one knew who you were to being the guy who does this, and with 2 other people who are also now notorious for having done it. Can you tell me how that happened? What brought it about? How the first meeting of the conspirators went?
Well, sure. I mean, there are a variety of stories that have come into play here. One is that this actually is sort of my underlying personality. This is a very on-brand thing, as the kids say. You know, you see these things on Twitter and they say, you know, the tweet and it goes viral and everybody has to tell their little story. What's the most on-brand thing from your childhood or whatever? And I actually had this story, and I'll tell it. It's so on brand that it's worth mentioning here. I don't know if you've ever heard of the gag where you tell somebody gullible's written on the ceiling and they look up and it's of course not there, and you know, they were gullible. Well, when I was 10 or 11, actually had done this to my little brother enough times to where he had developed a resistance to it. So then I actually took a piece of chalk, blue chalk, and wrote gullible on the ceiling. And so I told my brother that gullible was written on the ceiling, and he was like, "You can't trick me, you can't trick me, you can't trick me." And finally goes and tattles to my mom, who then comes raging into the room, swearing expletives. He effing better not have written anything on the ceiling. And of course I had, and he went berserk because I had got him yet again. So it's sort of an on-brand humor for me. Now, you overspeak to call me a scientist. I do have a bachelor's degree in physics, but I became a mathematician, and scientists don't like to get wrapped up with mathematicians too much, but I am pretty rigorously logical, and that's an important aspect to this. I mean, I don't know if autistic is a word that is comfortable to use, but it's sort of a mathematical thing. It's high in mathematicians, and so there's this like level of disquiet with something that's just abjectly illogical and BS. With people kind of with my background. And this is, I think, why you see people like the famous hoax that we looked to for inspiration from Alan Sokal in 1995 or 6, transgressing the boundaries, something about a hermeneutic of quantum gravity or some nonsense, right? And so he's a physicist, and now Alan is no longer a physicist so much, although he's qualified, he's now a mathematician. And so again, you see this kind of mathematical physics background. And I think it's because we have a certain discomfort with certain extensions of BS. And it's also very unfair BS, and we don't like unfairness. So this was my motivations that got me into looking at this stuff in the first place. I saw people getting psychologically abused around the ideas of systemic racism and sexism. I saw in person, I watched a conversation in which a white working class man was told by a white woman who was not working class that white men's stories had been told and no longer needed to be told. And this was in 2012 or 13, and I was shocked. You know, to say that somebody doesn't get a voice anymore was a concerning thing for me. And of course, I saw exactly this theme repeated, and it went kind of viral on Twitter yesterday. So this is still an idea that's very prominent, and that worried me. Now, as for how I met Peter and Helen, that's a different story. I met Peter because we were both operating within the same circle. We were both active early in the 2010s in the New Atheist movement. I defended Sam Harris against probably an accusation of sexism or something that was bogus. And he was impressed with what I did. We connected, we started writing together. It was originally his idea to write a hoax paper in the first place in 2016, but it took us a long time to actually get to the point. Helen, we brought in. Helen, I had met in a huge argument on Twitter, which I'm sure I was right about, and she's sure she was right about to this day. And we became good friends and fast collaborators once she opened up. She's very protective of her writing, and we finally opened up, started talking to one another and working together and collaborating. So Peter and I asked Helen if she would join in on this project because she had a little bit of background in the relevant theories. For her master's degree in literature, she was required to learn psychoanalysis, or the Lacanian psychoanalytic lens. She was required to learn a little bit of postmodern theory and gender theory. And as somebody who'd been a feminist her whole life, she already knew a lot of kind of the moral underpinnings. So we brought her in, and her role increased as we went along, to the point where finally she was outright writing papers with us rather than editing them and making sure that we were, academically rigorous and not going way outside of the range. So that's sort of how everything came together. But the hoaxing began with Peter and I seeing the now infamous feminist glaciology paper getting derided through 2016 in the media. In particular, we saw Matt Ridley make the comment that it must be a hoax. So it triggered the idea, well, they're ready for a hoax if this is what people are saying. And Peter knew Alan Sokol, so he had it kind of in the side of his mind. He said, let's write one. And I said, this will be fun. And I wrote the first draft of The Conceptual Penis as a social construct probably in the next 3 hours. And it's all been history from there.
James, you mentioned that you were involved in the New Atheist movement. In my recent book, Live Not by Lies, I, a conservative Christian, cite you at length, your work at length, because I think it's fantastic and it helps illuminate something that my tribe, conservative Christians, are dealing with. Similarly, Barry Weiss has praised my book, and I praised her work. And she said to me at one point, she said, if 2 years ago you had said to me, she's a left-wing Jewish lesbian, that she would be on the same side as Rod Dreher, she said, I wouldn't have believed you, but here we are. And I feel the same way. When I was in Prague doing research for Live Not by Lies, I asked Kamila Bendova. She was part of the inner circle of Václav Havel's dissident movement. I asked her how she and her husband, who were strict Catholics, how they managed to work with Havel and his circles, because they were rather, no pun intended, bohemian in their lifestyles. And she said to me something really important. She said, it was so difficult to find people who had the courage to stand up to communist totalitarianism, that when you found someone who did, they became your fast friend and solid ally, because you wouldn't find many people who may have shared your convictions, your Christian convictions, for example, who wouldn't stand up. So I think that is a really useful idea for all of us who hate cancel culture, even though we may be coming at it from completely different points of view. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I actually agree with that pretty much completely. And I honestly, when I was more active, and I don't care one whit about so-called atheist movements or whatever these days, but when I was more active in these kinds of things a few years ago, I would have rankled at the idea. Ben Shapiro, for example, is very well known for arguing that the entirety of Western civilization is rooted in Judeo-Christian values. And I would rankle at this, but it's actually true. And there's a common heritage there in addition to the willingness to stand up against something different. And now my research lately has gone more and more deeply into kind of the roots. This is something I'm always very interested in doing, getting deep into the roots. I don't just want to understand, say, critical race theory or something. I want to know where critical race theory came from. So obviously in Cynical Theories, Helen and I trace it back to its postmodern elements. I've also traced it back deeply into its critical theory elements through Herbert Marcuse, then backwards to Max Horkheimer. You can see the Gramscian elements if we look at Antonio Gramsci's, prison notebooks and his what became known as the Long March to the Institutions model. So all of these roots, but if I keep going back where I see, and this puts me at some agreement and some disagreement with the philosopher Stephen Hicks, and we just had a week-long trip together and spent a lot of time discussing where we are with this. I see the main point of diversion actually in one of the kind of mentors or grand mentors of Karl Marx. So communism becomes very interesting or relevant here. And that's actually Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. I see Hegel as very, very deeply relevant. And what I actually see there is that whereas you and I, from a Christian versus a non-believing perspective, would have certain differences, we have so much in common underneath that. For example, you believe in a God that is, a God that's transcendent, a God that's bigger. If I might speak for your religion for a moment, the Alpha, the Omega, all of this, I believe in a world that is bigger, that we are subject to, that we have to humiliate ourselves before, try to learn about and live within, and still honor and respect. And so I see this as being not particularly a gigantic diversion, so long as we have similar other values in common, and gospel values have infused throughout, Judeo values have infused throughout the Western canon. Where Ben Shapiro's argument is, Jerusalem meets Athens, he's not incorrect in this analysis whatsoever. So we have a great deal in common. Now, Hegel, however, reorganized metaphysics completely. And part of his purpose was to throw off what he saw as the Orientalism of Christianity imposing itself upon the German people. And he wanted to head back toward a different, more folkish style of religion for Germany. And of course, Hegel was a gigantic statist, so he also wanted to see the Prussian state become, the model of the future of the world, which has led to a few atrocities down the line as it worked out. And so I see this gigantic diversion metaphysically, which I think would be a wonderful conversation to have in depth with you at some point, between whether it's, and these are bookmarks. I don't want to go too deep into it. We're not going to die, but between the Judeo-Christian and Spinozan maybe approach to deity, I see a great deal of similarity. If you don't like Spinozan, we could say Jeffersonian. He famously took a razor knife, cut all of the miracles out of the New Testament, but kept all the rest, the kind of great teacher of Jesus. And so I see so much strong parallelism between those traditions, and especially the humility before something bigger than yourself, that diverges in Hegel, where all of a sudden you have this new dialectic of history that's progressing, and it uses people to progress the dialectic of history. And so that people now become involved, not just in the movement of history, but in the actualization of the absolute. So the deity becomes aware of himself by comparing himself against the other, that is his creation, as it unfolds by the action of progressive humans. That's basically young Hegelianism, not Hegel's philosophy totally. The young Hegelian model is the last part. Progressive humans are the ones who do this. The rest of it was all pure Hegel. Phenomenology of spirit and logic of science cover this. And so that's a complete departure. That's not humility before some transcendent thing that's bigger than you, that you are blessed to be a part of. That's now you are kind of an integral protagonist in the story of deity, which is usually tends to lead to an open door to megalomania and psychopaths being able to step in. And this is where you see, there are 50 varieties of socialism. Why is it that Marxism is the only one that's created wide-scale catastrophe everywhere it goes? You could say that the welfare state causes problems, but it doesn't create wide-scale catastrophe. It doesn't march millions into famine and blenders. It doesn't shoot people into mass graves. Why is it Marxism? And of course, Marx was putting this dialectical materialism, which he derived from this Hegelian dialectic. And so we have a very different metaphysic of how all of history and humans' role in history now proceeds. So I see it as a completely different religious and philosophical tradition, whereas the ones that you and I have luxury differences between our worldviews. This is a fundamental difference about how history and the world and the universe are organized, and what human beings' role in that is.
Well, I first became aware of you with the Grievance studies hoax, but then I read this phenomenal essay you wrote about social justice as a new religion. And it really helped me understand this better than I had before, because I've been analyzing it as a political phenomenon. And in fact, you say it's a religious phenomenon. Can you give us very briefly your take on why we should better understand critical social justice as a form of religion?
Well, I mean, it depends on which angle you want to come from. The essay that you probably read was before I fully understood the relevance of Hegelian metaphysics. And so the Hegelian metaphysical model that I've just kind of spoken about is obviously very important. He has a huge diversion from the Judeo-Christian model. And when you have taken as an article of faith that history progresses as the dialectic progresses, and I can tell you that the critical race theorists, for example, believe this. There's actually the sentence appears in the book Critical Race Theory and Introduction. They have this huge story about how movements do this and then they get smaller, the big problems get solved and the smaller problems get turned to, and then the paragraph ends with, and so the dialectic progresses. So they are actually thinking in this way, but it's an article of faith to believe that the dialectic and that history progresses through the way that the dialectic progresses. So now we have an article of faith that has really a catechism attached to it that, whether it's grafted on values of social justice or not, it's still this dialectical catechism. You still have to understand that the world moves in certain ways, that whenever you see something put forth as something that's going on in the world, first you take it to its abstract, then you hit it with its negative, and then you look for some synthetic concrete thing in between. So you have all of the kind of underlying operating system of a faith tradition here. And then at the same time, it's very odd because I think it arose as it has in the Western tradition, to where it's adopted, many of the kind of Augustinian constructs that you would see even in the kind of the Christian faith, but with none of the good side. And when I say Augustinian construct, of course, I'm talking about, it has a model of original sin. That original sin is that you are born on the oppressor side of, the original sin is that oppression, systemic oppression came into the world. And that if you are on the side that is favored by that system of oppression, which Marx would have called the capitalist superstructure, what critical race theorists would call white supremacy, which is a superstructure in exactly the same way that Marx used it, which the queer theorists, for example, would call cis heteronormativity. If you are privileged by that, then you have the stain of original sin. This is exactly the idea of Augustine's take on how sin entered the world and it stained all of humanity, etc. And so you have this religious Augustinian construct about how human beings relate to the good and evil of the world. And this creates, of course, a model where you have saints and prophets being people who are able to see this. So they experience systemic oppression in their lived experience, and then they can testify upon what that's like. And this becomes something like scripture that you have to listen to. You listen and believe. That's kind of the order that goes along with this. And so you have prophets.
It's about authority. They're the ones who have the authority to define reality. And that, I think, is what makes it so much like a religion. And the thing that was so revelatory for me about your analysis several years ago was that liberalism is powerless in the face of this, because liberalism depends on the ability to reason towards truth. And this is more like a revealed religion, or like Bolshevism, which operated as an apocalyptic millennial political cult.
Yeah, the difficulty is that, in fact, this evolved as a parasite on liberalism as well. And so it took all of the most valuable pillars of liberal thought and it undermined them quite intentionally. So reason, well, we look to Foucault. Well, knowledge it's not in the sense that Francis Bacon said knowledge is power. It's now the sense that knowledge and power are identical concepts. So if I try to make a claim about the truth, or I try to apply reason, or I claim a methodology, that's just a cultural construct that upholds my way of thinking. We can turn to Herbert Marcuse instead, and it's false consciousness all the way down. So it's adapted itself not only to hit Western civilization's moral weak spots like racism and sexism and so on, and those being liberal weak spots in particular, but it's also undermined the very pillars. And so we read, for example, in Critical Race Theory and Introduction, again, in the very first paragraph, they say that critical race theory specifically calls into question the very foundations of the liberal order. And then it names the things that the pillars that it intends to knock out. And those include equality theory. So we're going to get rid of equality. So, from a religious perspective, Imago Dei is gone, but from a liberal perspective, all men are created equal, which is a secular rendering of that same concept, gone. they say, so equality theory, legal reasoning, so there goes rule of law. Enlightenment rationalism, that's the idea of reason and truth that I was just discussing that you brought up. And then the neutral principles of constitutional law. So now neutrality is going to go out, and the idea that the Constitution is the best way, you know, as a kind of primeval is not the right word, but as like a law before the law, for a organizing principle of a society or a country or civilization. That's all got to get fundamentally dragged into question. And so, yeah, this is a completely different model that has been very effective, not just at undermining liberalism, but I've also described it. You say that this is, you know, this is the kind of thing that, oh no, totalitarians would do this. I've compared it to a virus. They compare themselves to a virus. So there's actually, they wrote a paper, Women's Studies as a Virus, in 2016. I've talked about this paper a bunch. They compare themselves favorably to HIV and Ebola. They say that the metaphor of the virus is the ideal feminist pedagogy. They talk about literally, you know, infecting people with their ideology and then sending them off into other departments or disciplines, academic or professional, and using those people as infectious agents to infect those cells to reproduce. They talk in the paper about how if a viruses like HPV can cause cancer, and that represents permanent transformational change, so cancer is good. And this is how they describe themselves. So when I say it's like a virus, I give this defense. I'm not trying to be glib. I'm not trying to be, you know, what is it when you dehumanize? I'm not trying to dehumanize them. They've compared themselves in terms of their approach to a virus. And I think it's a fitting metaphor. And what it does is, since we have the coronavirus, it's a nice thing. People know these things kind of now. You know, there's all this ACE2 receptors or whatever they're called that the spike protein would attach to. Well, these kind of best pillars of liberalism are where the spike proteins attach. Your better nature, your appeal to truth. Let's hear the argument. Let's listen. Let's hear it all out. Let's give people the benefit of the doubt. Let's assume they're going to be trying to make sense the best that they can, etc. All of those things are the places that the virus actually attaches. So liberal society is in particular vulnerable to this particular virus.
And most of all, compassion, you know, care for the weak. This is one of the greatest features of Christianity and of Enlightenment culture that emerged out of Christianity. But as René Girard said 20 years ago, he said that this Christian concern for the weak and this liberal human rights concern for the weak has been absolutized and turned into a mechanism of tyranny and totalitarianism. But that's something that's very hard for people to see, because everybody wants to be kind to the weak and the marginalized.
To this subject, I have just a simple question. You talk a lot about, you know, joking to send conservative message at the beginning of your intervention. Do you think that in the future we could joke again? We could still joke? Because in my French point of view, for example, in France, I have the impression that little by little we can't laugh anymore about anything.
I'm an optimist in general, so I tend to think that the answer is yes, we can, in fact, but we have to understand where that comes from. We have to understand where trust comes from and start to rebuild it. And so I kind of, you know, opened telling a couple of lessons that I learned to resist cancel culture. And well, another lesson that's very important in life is that trust is extremely difficult to earn and very easy to lose. So we who want to rebuild our society and to put this kind of backbone back into Western civilization have to think a lot, I think, about where does that come from? How do you actually build that? How do you resist? What mistakes do you make that cause you to lose it? And how do we orient ourselves in a way so that we are back? You know, institutions that want to arise and survive and lead in the coming century, how do they position themselves so that they are in a place where they constantly are looking to build trust and, more importantly, resist the idea that it's going to be subverted from within? And that's, I think, where we were just mentioning liberalism. We have to be very much more vigilant than we have been in some time, at least since the Berlin Wall came down, I would say.
James, that's a question of strategy. Do you think we will win?
Do it. I am an optimist, so I think that yes, I do. I just don't know how long it will take. So the Soviet Union fell apart. It just took 70 years, right? And it wasn't exactly a pleasant 70 years for the people who were subjected to that tyranny. The thing is that these kinds of totalitarian systems are not built to last. The question is just how much damage they do once they've kind of institutionalized themselves as they start to unwind. If we would have been having this conversation 3 or 4 months ago, certainly 4 months ago, I would have been a bit more pessimistic about our prospects, but something in the wind has changed. I've watched several of these narratives, especially in the US surrounding race, not stick. They attempt them and they don't stick, and people are pushing back. And so I understand that the strategy that they have to use in this kind of a, if we think of it as attempted revolution, is that they have to have top down, which they certainly do now in the United States, at least, but in most institutions throughout the Western world. But they also have to have bottom up. A lot of people have to be willing to go along with it. That's the thesis of live not by lies, really. If the bottom stops living by lies, the whole thing falls apart. And I think that the bottom has been knocked out. And when that happens, the harder the top presses down, the faster the bricks fall out of the bottom. And I think, for example, here in the United States, we see that with the Biden administration. They're trying things. People are getting freaked out. People are, as we say, waking up or red pilling. But what that is that the bottom is dropping out. Bricks are falling out of this squeezed in position. So they're not going to be able to quite build the wall that they were trying to build to hold it in. Reading in so-called political ponerology recently, I was reading there, and near the end, he talks about how what happens with these types of movements, he calls them pathocracies, ruled by pathology, or by pathos, if we want to be more Greek, is that they work for a while, and then people start to make fun of them. Normal people can't be forced into living by lies forever. And we're well into the joking phase now. This is very widely a joke. Most of the things, we have YouTube having to try to censor how many dislikes come on Joe Biden's videos. We have, every time the World Economic Forum opens its mouth, they get ratioed on social media to a grotesque degree. There's a great deal of awareness, dissatisfaction. There's a lot of humor being applied now against it in a very real way. As somebody who was using humor against it 4 years ago, I can appreciate that there's a lot more of it now than there was then. There was fear before, and now there's a lot of humor and eyes rolling and people getting upset and literally mad. And so I actually feel like we're, reading that book, I get the impression we're now, and I don't know how accurate that book is, of course, but we're in those later stages where this thing is starting to unravel very quickly. The question of winning or losing at this point becomes, do they apply force? And if they apply force, maybe we end up in something very, very much like a Soviet Union. But it'll probably be global, or something very much organized like current China, which is organized, under the model pioneered by Deng Xiaoping. It's not Maoist any longer. So those are possibilities, but I think they have to more or less use force at this point. Freedom has gone loose, at least, and I understand that the context there in Hungary is a little bit different than the context I face here in the United States, but certainly in the free states, if we'll call them those, Florida, most of the southern states. I'm from Tennessee. I'm currently in Michigan. Even Michigan's cracking, but it's certainly not as free of a state. And so within the free states, it's certainly the case that freedom has gotten loose, and that's a hard genie to put back in the bottle, and it's progressing into the unraveling phase. Hopefully the damage that will be done will only be to things like Harvard's brand for the next decade or two. And, the New York Times can live in infamy for a decade or two until people forget again. Hopefully the damage is limited to that and what few casualties that we've had from, medical abuses and so on so far.
On that hopeful note, James Lindsay, peerless scourge of the woke, thank you for your good words and your time today.
Thank you, Rod. Thanks, guys.